handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er 8 9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEPT. Gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I've called on somebody we haven't spoken to in a long time, and he's agreed to be with us, and that's Jim Babka. And he runs a fabulous website, or two actually, downsizedc.org, and the other one is the Zero Aggression Project. And you can also find them on Twitter and Facebook, and I wish you would, because Jim's doing some remarkable work and asking some hard questions. And so I'm going to ask him the questions that he's asking us and see what his answers are. So with that, Jim, thanks for being with us, and long time no talk to.
Yeah, it's been about a year. I'm glad to be back on. A little more than I think. I'm glad to be back on.
I think so too. Couple of things, and I want you to, kind of filibuster me. So this is your presentation. But the first thing is legislation by unelected bureaucrats. Look, Jim, this has been going on a long time. We certainly would love to fix that, but is it ever really fixable?
Well, it is. We didn't have, much of the regulatory state apparatus that we have didn't exist until the railroads came along. And that's, kind of the beginning of all of that. And then the progressive era came along, and they attempted to put together a non-patronage-based bureaucracy, and over time they gave it more and more powers. And then in the 1940s and 50s, there were some court decisions that basically kind of gave them a final stamp approval. They were presumed to be doing the Lord's work every time that they issued a regulation, so courts themselves would defer to them. So we didn't get to this process, we didn't start this way and didn't get to this process overnight, but we have been in roughly the same position since the 1950s and 60s, where the regulatory state continues to send down edicts that have the binding effect of law. We have legislation without representation and really no recourse to do a great deal about it.
Jim, we came to learn about regulations, and some people haven't just really paid nearly enough attention to it, but I think it kind of exploded under EPA and exploded under Obamacare. And remember, if I'm not mistaken, Obamacare started off at 1,200 pages or 2,000 pages, whatever that number was. Then all of a sudden went up to 12,000, because you had all these stipulations and regulations and all these requirements. Which and the same thing actually happened with EPA under this whole Clean Water Act, right?
Okay, so I'm a little more familiar with the details that occurred under Obamacare, because Downsized DC was active in opposing Obamacare. And Nancy Pelosi very famously said, we're going to have to pass this bill in order to find out what's in it. Now, most people take that to mean that she hadn't read the bill, that she didn't, she wasn't doing her due diligence. And of course, we have a bill to deal with that issue, because Congress doesn't read many of their bills, and that's called the Read the Bills Act. But the issue that she was actually addressing is the one that you're beginning to describe, Denise. She was explaining that there was more than 20 different bodies, boards, administrative agencies that were going to need to be created. And so those things hadn't even been, the law would create them, and then appointments would be made and people would be put on those boards. And then the people on those boards would begin writing their rules. And so since those agencies weren't there, those people were not yet employed, and no pen had been put to paper yet, we literally didn't know what all was going to be in the law. And this is what Congress routinely does. Your congressman, if we're talking about an earmark, cares deeply about the detail of how a dollar and cent is going to be spent, back in his local district or on a pet project or for some crony that is benefiting him. So they can legislate down to the details of severe minutia. They can really get into the nitty-gritty. But on the broad picture of things, when it comes to how to regulate and how to do various things, they defer very heavily to the bureaucracy. And law is frequently written in such a way that they're basically a group of people are told, here's the general parameters. You go write something that fits that general parameters and executes the act. And there is some executive power that needs to sometimes be carried out. We don't expect them to sit there and draw out how the tax form is actually going to look. But what happens in between is that these agencies have accumulated to themselves broad lawmaking power. They have interpreted what Congress's intentions are, sometimes interpreted them a specific way that wasn't necessarily the way that Congress was, the debate actually went and flowed, and went out and proceeded to implement the law by adding additional regulations, by enhancing or giving us more and more rules. And conservatives started talking about this because they opposed the progressive era back in the late 60s and on up through the 80s. You used to hear a lot of people say things like, this year, the Federal Register, which was the set of regulations handed down, not laws passed by Congress, but the Federal Register, has grown by this number of pages. And it would now stack this tall. And it's got this many new rules in it. And to this very day, the organization called the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI, counts that number every year and issues a report. They count and say how much it's grown, and it has consistently, for a couple of decades now, grown faster than the laws passed by Congress by quite a margin. And so that's the process we're concerned about, is this ability to come out and have unelected bureaucrats build up a code book of their own that is bigger than the code book of Congress because Congress has handed them this power.
So the bottom line is that when you pass a law, you end up with laws upon laws upon laws because pages and pages and pages get. So it's not just passing one law. You by default end up passing all these other regulations, which end up really being a stipulation or an additional piece part to the law. Correct?
Yeah, and I actually go to a much more fundamental place on this. So I think the Constitution is the bare minimum standard. My ideals, I believe, exceed those. I think there's a whole host of things that we shouldn't trust the government to do, some of which powers are even given. I don't think they should have. But let's at least agree as a minimal standard together that if the power wasn't granted, if it was not enumerated, as they say, by the Constitution, they don't have it. Let's at least agree that the rules that were set up for three separate co-equal branches will be honored and abided by and obeyed. And that let's at least agree that we all should have, just like we should have taxation, we shouldn't have taxation without representation. We definitely should not have regulation without representation. Mm-hmm. People who did not run for office and who are not accountable at the polls should not be writing law. Article 1 spells out the duties and responsibilities of Congress, and they have the power to write the laws. So I like to use this analogy to drive home the point. Let's say, Denise, for the sake of fun, that you have a very expensive, beautiful, nice, new sports car, okay? Ferrari, Maserati, whatever your taste is, okay? And you are going out of town. And you say, Jim, I'm giving you the keys to the house and the garage and everything, and you can even take the Ferrari out if you want. Here are the keys, okay? And I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Now, if the second you walk out the door, I start calling all my friends and to invite them over, and I give them the keys to start taking your Ferrari for a joyride, I have engaged in a immoral or unjust or unfair, I don't know what word you want to use, delegation of power. Mm-hmm. You handed me the keys and told me I could drive the car, but you did not hand me the keys and say, Jim, any Tom, Dick, or Harry that you know can come over and drive my car. You would be upset, more than likely, to find out that other people drove your car. This is exactly what the Constitution was designed to address. We delegated to Congress the ability to make laws. That's a power that we, the people, said, here are the keys. You go do that. And then they take those keys and they start handing to a bunch of people we've not met at the ballot box and say, you're in charge now. Go drive the American people's car. Mm-hmm. And we say that process is illegitimate and we want it stopped.
All right. Here's a unicorn and rainbow question for you. And that is, how about we don't pass any, or we have a law that says we don't pass any laws unless there are stipulations within that law. In other words, we're going to pass law number 10. And law number 10 says this law will cost, or this law will save X dollars in some period of time. If after that period of time it does not meet that text, then the law itself implodes.
Well, a sunset, that sounds kind of similar to a sunset law.
Yeah.
There's a little nuance difference there. That could be a potential approach, and I believe in sunset laws. I think every single thing that is done should be done for a temporary period of time, and the default position upon its expiration is that it should be permitted to expire unless something affirmative is done. Something that breaks inertia is picked up and done to resuscitate it, right? If nobody does anything, gone.
Correct.
And so I would support something like that, but our proposal on this has been a bill called the Write the Laws Act. And in the Write the Laws Act, which is a bill that we've written, and you can come read at downsizedc.org. Just come to our homepage. It's one of the 3 things near the top of our homepage that we feature. This is part of our Downsize DC agenda, and it's really core to our Downsize DC agenda. It's one of our 3 main proposals. And what it does is it says that all regulation from this point forward can be drafted by whoever. It can be drafted by the experts in the bureaucracy. We're fine with that. But it has to be voted on up or down by Congress in the same way that any law has to be passed. It has to be voted upon by Congress. We also say that there needs to be a report put together by the General Accounting Office that delivers to us all the regulations that are in the code that have been passed, and it needs to put them up on the dock for expiration, and Congress has to affirmatively vote whether or not they want to keep those regulations. So basically, it's going to create a whole new review of all existing regulation over a period of time so that we can get all regulation in compliance with this representation principle. Unlike a mere rule, because we don't trust Congress to actually obey their rules, they don't, we actually have made this a binding law. We say that after a certain point, starting immediately with new regulations and in the past over time, that if you find yourself in the dock, you find yourself charged with not paying a tax or fee that was set by the regulators, if you find yourself in violation of some regulation that they proposed and passed within their own structure, you could go to court and say, this law was not passed following the Write the Laws Act, and the judge could kick the case out with impunity. So what a lot of people don't realize, and this is our access to Article 3 courts, is that a lot of regulation, we have so centralized things that in our government that not only are these executive branch agencies doing executive branch work, and as we're discussing doing legislative branch work, but they've also set up their own court networks. And access to an Article 3 court requires you to go through their process, which usually has 2 stages involved in it. They have their own court and their own appeals court, and you can't get to an Article 3 court until you have already run the gauntlet with them, which wears people down to a nub. A lot of people can't afford to spend the money on the attorneys and the headaches and the time that's going to have to be absorbed into getting out of that into an Article 3 court. And as we already covered in our courts have, since the Supreme Court in the 50s and 60s, has said, hey, if the bureaucrats said this was okay, it's good enough for us. They're to be presumed or believed that what they've done is necessary and correct. So we're saying we're going to give you immediate access to an Article 3 court. We're going to give you immediate access to a judge who will look at this and say, you're right, they didn't follow the Write the Laws Act procedure. This regulation isn't binding on you, Ms. Simon. You're free to go.
Jim, we have something called the Congressional Budget Office. And, we keep hearing that, before a law, gets voted on in one of the chambers, it gets run through the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Budget Office runs through a whole bunch of, equations and see what this is going to cost, or what they do a financial doable
projection.
Assessment. Yes.
Yeah, they do a projection. Yeah.
are those ever really believable?
Okay.
Okay, the side probably answered
certain things that you usually aren't supposed to say on radio. I'm trying to figure out how to rephrase my colorful remark. A long time ago, I said, I have a quote attributed to me that pro forma is Latin for bull you know what. Okay? If you ever heard of a pro forma budget, it's the, you want to talk about a unicorn and a rainbow. It is, here's what we think is going to happen, and we'll go trot this out to investors. We've got this wonderful idea, and we're going to do X and Y in this amount of time, and it's going to be all beautiful, and we're going to do nothing but make money based on the following projections. And so I do think that there is a large degree to which those things have to be suspect because no one knows the future. Is it an educated guess? Am I questioning the honesty of the people in the Congressional Budget Office? It is an educated guess, and no, I'm not questioning their honesty. I'm not even questioning their partisanship. I really do think that most of the time they do a pretty good job. In fact, if they are wrong on something, you probably should look to how Congress gives them their instructions. There's a whole, you talked about Obamacare, those instructions were written so that the thing would not look like a tax. And that had to do a lot, not with just the political salesmanship, but it also had to do with how the bill was going to be analyzed by CBO. They wrote this thing so that they could make it look revenue neutral. They literally tied CBO's hands to make it look revenue neutral. So I don't trust CBO, not because I don't trust CBO. I don't trust CBO because I don't think they have crystal balls, and Congress is often rigging the rules.
Well, all right, let's try it this way then. How about some other entity, and it could still be the Congressional Budget Office perhaps, but some other entity, some accounting firm or something does an assessment on a law a year after it has been in place to see if it is within the realm of the estimated cost or cost savings that was estimated in the bill in the first place. Nobody ever does it, do they?
I think you're on the cusp of an idea I'd never thought of before, and that I'm intrigued and interested in, that I want to think about more. What I think I hear you suggest, if I could play this back in my own words, is that every goal, every piece of legislation would have a set of goals. It would have a set of metrics.
Yes.
These are the things that we said we would do.
Yes.
So maybe at the top of the bill it would say promises we're making. And if the promises aren't met, maybe there's some kind of default that kind of kicks the bill back and says, nope, sorry, this thing's not authorized for year 3 and 4 because it didn't do what it said it would do in years 1 and 2.
Stick with me.
I'm kind of intrigued by this. I don't know how you would structure such a thing like this. The hard part of this is, so we were very much for this idea of making Congress put a constitutional statement at the beginning of their bill.
I remember that one. That was a Michelle Bachmann thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Enumerated Powers Act, and we were promoting it all the way back in 2006 and 7, and when the Tea Party Congress took over in 2000, after the 2010 elections, they passed the Enumerated Powers Act in 2011. It was one of the very first things they did. And, we cheered. Well, first, they don't enforce the rule. So there's most, even though it is in the rules, most pieces of legislation don't have a constitutional statement. But the constitutional statements in the beginning of those bills are jokes. The ones that did cover the provision, they general welfare clause, let's drive a truck through that. Let's make that thing mean what it doesn't mean, and let's drive a truck through it. So we say no. That didn't really do much to move the needle. I'm wondering how you would word this that they couldn't. You always have to. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Screw Tape Letters, and in it is the screw tape. It is a old demon explaining to a young demon how to tempt, how to cause people to fall into temptation. And C.S. Lewis said that it was the hardest book he ever wrote because he had to pretend he was evil. He had to put on an evil mind in order to sit down and think about, what are the diabolical ways of getting people to do things. So when you're dealing with Congress, you have to go into a very diabolical mode, right? You have to start to think like a congressman. You almost have to think like a demon. What are they going to do? And so I would want to take time. The real pitfall in good ideas like this is trying to figure out how they're going to game it, and can we still get enough marginal benefit? Because they are going to game it. It's inevitable. Sure. But can we design something where we still get enough marginal benefit out of the equation. And that's why I'm very high, for example, on a One Subject at a Time Act or a Read the Bills Act, because I see we're not going to stop them from all bad behavior, but what we are going to do is make their jobs harder. And, that's what a good regulation does, right? It makes people's jobs harder. That's why I'm opposed to it in the market sector, because I don't want to make a business owner's job harder, right? But I definitely want to make a congressman's job harder.
Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have you sit in a panel before the Congressional Freedom Caucus and make a presentation on this, because obviously we have to vote on a new Speaker of the House here at some point. Mm-hmm. What would be your selling point on Write the Laws Act or Read the Bills Act to the Freedom Caucus, of which somebody there could end up being Speaker? There's a curveball.
Yeah, it is a curveball, and it is because it seems to me that the incentives for leadership are really bad. So, on like the One Subject at a Time Act, it's real obvious to me that rank and file members of the Congress should want this, because the rules are written in such a way that they never get, they routinely get held accountable for things that they would never support. You take the One Subject, our One Subject at a Time Act, which is our primary initiative at downsizedc.org right now, has 27 total sponsors in the House, starting with Mia Love of Utah. And it says that everything has to be limited to one topic. And without getting in all the nitty-gritty details, we're dealing with something that I call bill clustering. And in this cluster, they take a sure to pass idea and they attach a bunch of things that cannot stand on their own, which is another way in which you lose representation.
Yes.
And what ends up happening for these rank and file members of Congress, people who are not part of the anointed leadership, is that they go back home to their district and they get attacked by their opponents in primaries and general elections. A Republican who would never vote for a tax increase is suddenly responsible for voting for 28 tax increases. He voted for 28 tax increases. Well, that turns out to be some of the sausage, some of the clustering that was stuffed into the bill. It was, so they voted for the main bill, but these other things were in there. And Mia Love specifically identified, I want this bill because I'm not part of the leadership. So I don't know necessarily what we ask of the leadership. It would be more the people who are picking. What is it that you, in picking your leaders in Congress, want? And my pitch would be more to them as a caucus. The Write the Laws Act would do an awful lot and some important stuff in terms of reining in the deficit and the expense that we're dealing with.
Well,
a piece of legislation like Obamacare could never have been passed with the Write the Laws Act in place. Right.
Jim, there are so many moving parts to all of this, and to even begin to gain some kind of control back, it's not a single, ramp that we have to take. I mean, there would be many, and you've described many of them here. The regulations piece.
Those are all little mechanical tasks.
Yes, that's a good word.
Let me say something kind of meta, okay?
Quickly, we got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, we self-limit ourselves. I go and talk to people about these bills, and they go, "Oh, this would be a great idea, but it'll never happen," and that is enough reason for them not to do anything. But the fact of the matter is, if just enough of us would get off the fence on that and say, "No, we want it," it would happen overnight. So there's already enough of us who agree. We're limiting ourselves.
Exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, please go visit downsizedc.org. Jim, I'm sad that I haven't had you back more often, and so I'm not going to let that happen again. But thanks for your good work, and ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
You are about to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I've tapped at a kind of a distant buddy again. I'm coming to thoroughly enjoy this man because he's so insightful, and every time I talk to him, I get smarter, which is a great thing. But Jack Barsky has agreed to be with us. Now, Jack is the author of Deep Undercover, which you can find on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and the rest of them. And the resume, which probably doesn't do it justice, but nonetheless, Jack is a former KGB sleeper agent that operated in the United States for 10 years. He has contributed to Fox News. In fact, he was on there 2 nights in a row about a week or so ago. 60 Minutes did a feature on Jack, and he's been on the Denise Simon Experience previously. So, Jack, thanks for staying with us and being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Yeah, notably on the Denise Simon Experience. Thanks for having me.
All right, look, we had this recent event where the United States has arrested and indicted Maria Butina, who somehow found her way into the conservative circles in the United States, least of which would be the National Rifle Association. And she's found her way into having an affair with a conservative Republican operative, and then a rather famous sheriff, and several other circles. And a lot of people out there are really scratching their heads going, yeah, right, this is really not, this is kind of a show thing that the Department of Justice is doing, because we don't have these kind of Russian operatives running around the United States. I mean, Jack, why is it that we can't seem to get Americans to understand that we not only have Russian operatives running around the United States, but we've got Chinese and, from several other nations, friendly or not friendly, that are doing these spy games? What are people missing?
Well, first of all, every country that has some means and is not totally isolated will do some espionage. Fundamentally, that's part of human nature. When somebody has a secret and it might impact you, you want to find out, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes back all the way to antiquity. So, and the Russians have had, starting with the Soviet Union, a phenomenal history of building an apparatus that is, at one point, was unequaled and still is unequaled in history. And that hasn't changed as much, other than they don't have the same resources nowadays, Russia does, than the Soviet Union did. But if you can spy, you will, and this is what they're doing. This lady clearly is an example of sort of a somebody with a semi-cover. She came here as a Russian citizen with a cover. At first she studied, and I don't know what else she did. And that's not a problem. It's not a crime to interact with a person like that. And she was, based on what I have read in the media, she was extraordinarily successful in making connections that could eventually lead to some interesting intelligence. So there's some people think that this was just one of those phony arrests. I don't think so. That girl is real, and there's no two ways about it. And there are many others sort of like her that have either direct relationships with Russian intelligence, or are at least in having unofficial contacts. You understand? If Russia is a totalitarian state, Russian Secret Service, the Russian government pretty much knows as to who is going abroad, who is doing what, where, and it would be an oversight by intelligence if they wouldn't approach these people and not ask them to do a favor for Mother Russia. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, there is a phenomenal attachment by Russians to Mother Russia, Mother Earth, historically, and that hasn't changed that much. This is one of the reasons that Putin has been able to stay in power that long, which far exceeds the attachment that Americans have to the United States. That was a really long speech, but I'm going to stop now so you can ask.
No. I mean, people just seem to think it always happens in the movies, or it's in some kind of adventure, and that it really doesn't happen.
Well, what happens in the movies is a bunch of nonsense, but it happens. And this is the problem with American pop culture. It has so softened what might be considered pre-existing intellect that people just don't know what to believe anymore. The fact of the matter is, this is happening, and yeah, I understand that people. Well, yeah, that's just all in the movies. And there is a naivete that has enveloped our nation that is dangerous to our own health and existence.
You just said something that I think is precisely out of the Russian playbook, or the Soviet playbook, or the KGB, FSB, SVR playbook, and that is people don't know what to believe anymore. And that is the exact thing that the Kremlin wants, correct?
Well, we're talking about what we used to call, in intelligence circles still called that way, is called active measures. Mm-hmm. That means fundamentally spreading false information. In the old days, that was done through the press primarily, and there were some phenomenal big lies that became sort of accepted truths in American society. For example, that the CIA invented the AIDS virus and things like that.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
That kind of stuff is so much easier nowadays to concoct and spread because of social media, because of the internet. I mean, on a daily basis, and I want to share who that is. In my family, I get people show me stuff and say, "Look what's on the internet." I look at it and it says, "Hello, this is not real." We have lost our ability to judge critically, and I think this has a lot to do with our failing educational system. And it starts way back when. When I look at American education, we have true and false. Exams. We have multiple choice. Thinking is not really critical thinking is not in high demand. And we're learning in school to repeat what the teacher has told us, and if we deviate from that because we think about it, we might not get an A. So I mean, this is a whole big subject altogether. But the Russians are fundamentally they got wise. They understand America much better than they did when I was in the KGB, simply because there have been thousands and thousands of Russians who have studied in the U.S., who have actually integrated themselves in American life and then went back and they understand how this country works or doesn't work. Having said all of that, we don't need help by the Russians. We fabricate our own news on a daily basis.
Yes,
coming out of the White House, it's coming out of Congress, it's coming out of various journalistic installations. And it is all about, when it comes to journalism or whatever it's called, whatever it masquerades as these days. If I come out with a story first, I win. And my goodness, it's critical thinking is so important these days, and we don't have it. So,
okay,
yep,
I believe
we
you.
are sitting duck. We are a sitting duck, man. I got to tell you that.
Well, Jack, a few minutes ago we said that we've got these covert agents, if you will, these operatives all over the country, and they're not just in Washington D.C. or in New York. I mean, they could be in Miami, they could be in the Boston area, they may be in, I would say, some really circles of where technology hubs are, because that's where I think Russia and especially China want to be able to perform their espionage. Seattle is another one. And so, the FBI is actually tasked with learning who these people are, where they are, and then they got to tail them. And then all of a sudden, sometimes they lose them, and they have a terrible time trying to track them back down. Are the tactics very different today than they were during the Cold War?
Oh, yes, in some respects. When you talk about tailing, I met an ex-FBI special agent who operated in New York City when I was active, and he was one of several hundred, and he said, well, we were understaffed to even tail all the diplomats, the Russian diplomats. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, you want to tail somebody, very often you have to keep track of them in cyberspace. And it's so easy to mask yourself in cyberspace. It becomes a near impossibility. Your physical location isn't as important as who you are connected with through cyberspace. As I said, it's easy to mask yourself. And what I'm concerned with is what we call the insider threat. How many Russian nationals or work for Microsoft?
Yes.
I'm not saying that the majority of them are doing bad things, but if it's 1 in 1,000,
it's dangerous.
That could do tons of damage. And we're not equipped to find them all. I mean, this is almost. Let me repeat this: we're almost a sitting duck here, and the only way to counteract this is by more vigilance amongst the general public. And good luck with that.
There's really not anything inside the United States that's not of some interest to Russia and or China. I mean, if it's industrial, if it's intelligence, if it's agricultural, anything that they can gain from the United States for any kind of advantage.
You said it absolutely right. As we know, the Chinese steal a lot of
anything.
Yes, whatever could be of use, and then they duplicate it much cheaper or use it to build up their military. Absolutely right, 100%. Probably, if you want to sort of prioritize it, I think military espionage is probably at the top. Political espionage is sort of right there, but after that is industrial as well. Yeah, whatever. And it's well, having said all of that, we're doing it too, except, and we have a huge disadvantage. How many Americans really want to go to Russia and live there for a while and could be used to?
No.
So there you go.
But then they don't believe that Russia, out of St. Petersburg, had the Internet Research Agency, otherwise known as the Trolling Factory. They didn't believe that either. And
well, of course, and there's I'm surprised that we were actually, the Justice Department brought suit against those 12 Russians, supposedly members of the military intelligence. I'm surprised that we actually, it appears that we were able to trace these guys.
Yes.
I'm thinking we had some kind of an inside source to who gave us a tip, because as I said, it's so easy to mask yourself. And typically, what the Russian intelligence does, they have loose relationships with groups of hackers, sort of along the lines of plausible deniability. Well, we didn't do that. These guys did it, and they're independent operators.
Yes.
The fact that we indicted 12 GRU military intelligence kind of just boggles my mind. And by the way, if I may volunteer that indictment was 100% political.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that. I think it was a good thing, but it was the timing of it just prior to going to Helsinki. I would say that it was very political. It was kind of like, hey, especially when Chris Wallace interviewed Putin afterwards. Here's the document. You want it, and Putin wasn't going to touch it, was he?
No, but the point is, if you're really interested in advancing security for this country, if you identified some operatives, you keep them in the dark. You keep them thinking that they are not known. Mm-hmm. Instead of going out in public and indicting them, they will never be brought to trial. There will not ever be a trial in absentia, simply because if that were to be the case, you would have to go out in public and disclose some means by which you got this information, and you got to prove it. And on top of it, if there is a tipster, you may have to actually it's not going to happen. It was political. It's over. It's done with. I bet you we'll never talk about this again.
Well, I know that we got one. We got one about 2 years ago. We found him traveling, and he was in a resort. And he had some interesting computers with him. So we did get one similar in a similar case.
But he must.
The chances are.
He must. Yeah, he must have either been irrationally bold or just plain stupid, and I can relate to the irrationally bold because I used to be that way.
And then the United States is not the only victim in all of this, because the Russians
Oh,
do.
no.
All right.
Western Europe in particular, the bottom line is, they don't have unlimited resources. Their resources are significantly lower than what the Soviet Union did, so they have to sort of prioritize. But the main adversary is still the United States, and has been since the mid-1920s, 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Jack, if you're going to be sitting in a panel in front of Congress, what would you like to tell them? Like the Senate Intelligence Committee. What do you want to tell them?
I would fundamentally, and I would piss them off. Excuse my language. I would tell them to get politics out of intelligence work. I understand that intelligence agencies have to be supervised, so they don't go rogue like the CIA has done in the past. But this public grandstanding from the left and the right is playing political football with something that belongs to be handled by the folks that know how to do their work and can, to the extent possible, provide some security for this country and its citizens. This blabbing back and forth and this trumping one another with stuff where people don't even know what really is the truth. Mm-hmm. It doesn't help us in any way, shape, or form. And by the way, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we do air an awful lot of dirty laundry out there, and so, the Kremlin or Tehran or Pyongyang, they're all sitting back there with their arms crossed watching hearings and TV, and they're going, this is great stuff, right?
Correct. And those countries, by the way, don't have any dirty laundry because they don't show it. At least they don't show it, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So, no, that's one of the disadvantages of a democracy. You don't want to get to a point, as I said, there must be supervision, but we've gone way, way too far to air all that in public and then in the process of make things up. Mm-hmm. And that's what politicians are good at.
Indeed they are. Well, when you have hearings that are televised on C-SPAN and, mm-hmm. you're talking about other kind of issues way outside of the scope of Russia and China. Let's say we're having a hearing on immigration. Well, don't you think that you've got some Russian operatives that are going, oh, that seems to be the big issue over there in America. Let's go make that situation worse for them. So here come the trolls. Here come the fake accounts. You see what I'm saying? I mean, they'll do that with healthcare. They'll do it with any other issues that we may have. Correct?
Yes, but we can't get to a point to prohibit or forswear public discourse. We can't do that. If we get to that point, then they pretty much achieved their goal. We need to keep public dialogue alive. My point is, though, there are certain subjects that don't belong in the public on a daily basis. Go ahead.
I was going to say, what was your take on the Helsinki event?
I felt uncomfortable watching this. I happened to actually catch the press conference live, and when they were throwing that football, that soccer ball, back and forth, which then wound up in Melania's hands, I said, this is not good. This is not right. It doesn't work. I don't agree with anybody who says that Donald Trump is in Putin's pocket, this is nonsense. Donald Trump has way too much an ego to be in anybody's pocket.
Good point.
So they were playing kabuki theater with each other.
Yes.
Unfortunately, one of them is a dictator, and if you be nice to dictators, that really, historically, hasn't made one heck of a difference. If you played nice with Hitler, he started annexing neighboring countries. You played nice with Stalin, he grabbed some more territory. That doesn't work. And I think it has something to do with Donald Trump not being a student of history and not listening to people who are. That was fundamentally the wrong tactic to use. And he's pulled it back to some degree. But the basic problem is that the rest of the world, particularly our allies, don't know where they're at with our government, and this behavior gave the enemies of our government and our current government a phenomenal amount of ammunition to shoot at the president and go overboard, as a lot of them are wont to do. A couple of months ago, I spent a whole month in Germany marketing my book, and I was astonished to find out the average reasonably intelligent citizen, when it comes to siding either with Russia or the United States, it's at best a tie. And that is bothersome. It is troublesome because on many levels, for me, the Germans sort of got lost. They forgot what made Germany of today possible, who did that, and who was ready to take it over. The world is turning upside down these days.
Well, as a caveat, I will say that Bloomberg had reported that soccer ball ended up having some kind of a chip in it. But
this was another no news item.
Exactly.
I read it and I was looking for. So where's the news? Oh yeah, these balls all have chips, but it could have been something. But they're being tested by Secret Service, and I mean, there's 2 pages worth of no news, and on my Yahoo feed it was the #1 item. Why are we bothering with that clutter that has no meaning to anything that's going on?
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Jack Barsky, who is a great patriot here of America, and thank you for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. His book is Deep Undercover, and we thoroughly enjoy having you, Jack. We certainly enjoy the perspective and how you kind of keep up with all things to keep us informed, and your insight and summaries are especially important for people to understand that it isn't just in the movies. So thank you, Jeff, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, Notice. Ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEPT. Gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We can't seem to ever get past this immigration. I don't even know if it's an issue, if it's a scandal, if it's I don't know what it is anymore, but it's in headlines. So, David lnserra, who is the Heritage Foundation policy expert, and one of his expertises is on DHS, has been kind enough to join us here on the Denise Simon Experience to talk about one component, and I'm so happy to have this part of the discussion that really isn't mentioned, and that is what is happening in the home countries where these issues, these cases need to be handled before they ever get to a border. Did I say that right, David? And thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so this is an idea that we have on how I think we can improve the process by which, if we have people, a lot of people coming to our borders claiming asylum, we think that we might have a better way for that whole process to work, both in terms of how we enforce our laws, but also for how, if you actually have a legitimate asylum claim, actually better for those legitimate asylum seekers. And that involves how we can process asylum claims, and we can take an initial stab at reviewing those claims at our consulates abroad before you get to our borders.
David, isn't that actually how it's supposed to work in the first place? I mean, if you have to leave your Guatemala for whatever reason, you have to go through the official steps. And the official steps begin in Guatemala, not in some crisis situation in Arizona, right?
Yeah, so in the traditional visa process, you're exactly right. So in a traditional immigration sense, if you want to come to the United States, you have to go get a visa, which means showing up at a U.S. consulate in Guatemala or wherever else, and you show up and you have your interview, and there's a whole processing, and that's supposed to happen down there. Asylum is the unique case of what happens when someone shows up at your border and they claim that they can't go back home because they're the victim of persecution based on their race, their religion, their political beliefs, etc. And like I said, this is there are certainly cases where we have these asylum laws for a reason. You can imagine someone, for instance, getting off a plane from China and they say, I've been persecuted in China because I don't like the Communist Party in China or something like that. So it makes sense. We're not going to send those folks home. But in the most recent case, what we're seeing at our borders right now is that we're having a problem with a lot of people claiming asylum, and they're overwhelming our ability to handle and process these folks at our borders. And so one of our ideas as to help mitigate this is to, like I said, to push some of that back to what's going on at our consulates south of our border.
Is the State Department, David, behind in this regard? Because I know I watched some of this go on during the previous administration, that if you looked at the State Department's websites in those respective countries and their Twitter handles, there were all kinds of advice and steps in almost encouraging people how to get through the system and get into the United States faster. And I mean, I cultivated an awful lot of those websites. I mean, I looked at, not only those in Central America and Latin America, but I even went over to the Middle East and did some of those in Afghanistan and Sudan and Somalia and various places. Mm-hmm. Has the State Department cleaned up some of that yet, and understood some other propaganda power that is happening in those home countries, that they can mitigate that kind of encouragement, and we're not telling them, hey, this is all you have to do. And when you contact this person, I mean, it's almost like cheating the system. Are you aware of any of that?
Well, I'm not directly aware of that, but I think there's an important distinction that's worth making, which is that when we have people who are going through the correct way of doing things, especially when we're talking about like normal visas, like a student visa, a work visa, a tourist visa, these kind of things. I mean, I think it makes sense that the purpose of our consulates is to help those people get those tourist visas or whatnot. But when it comes to asylum, there's a certain level of we have to be absolutely sure about what you're telling us. There's the details of what you're telling us. The reason you're coming to the United States isn't because of tourism or travel or business or whatever.
Some domestic dispute.
you're claiming a particular fear of what's going on in your country that you can't stay there, and that's why, regardless of all the other things that we would normally consider, we should let you into the country. That's the argument you're making to us. And so if that's the case, it's a bit more, it's not necessarily adversarial, but it's a bit more, we're going to be, looking at these facts a little bit
intensive.
Differently. And so in these cases, like I said, what's happening is that we're getting past the border, or all this stuff is happening at our border, because that's usually where asylum claims are happening. And our thought is, well, look, if you've got a lot of people coming right now from Central America, they're coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they have to pass by all these consulates in say, Mexico.
Yes.
And they just have to. Why don't we put DHS officers in our consulates around Mexico and have them be the sort of the first line.
The case.
The first line, yeah, exactly. And that way we can weed out right at the get-go, like, cases that are like, no, you don't have a good claim. We can weed those folks out right away. And that makes it a little easier for us than at the border. If someone then shows up, we can say, you didn't do this the right way. You didn't go to the consulate.
Mm-hmm.
We're now going to hold you to a higher standard because you didn't do this the right way.
Well, the big thing here, David, is they feel, we're told, that we got to get out of Honduras, period. And this is the reason why. And if it's an asylum, you want to get out. So you go to the next country. Does the next country have to be Mexico, or can it be Guyana, or can it be Colombia or Panama? I mean, does it have to go north? Why not south? I guess the question is, some of these other countries actually, if they're traveling through there, they have a responsibility too. So it isn't just the United States diplomatic post, say, in Mexico, but I would say it'd be the Mexico's diplomatic laws, right?
I think there's a question that we should certainly be asking of folks who do come to the U.S. seeking asylum. And you rightly point out, if for instance you have someone coming from, say, Bolivia, well, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Mexico all provide for some sort of asylum, and so you have to pass through all those countries. And if that's the case, then we should ask the folks coming, well, okay, so you're claiming fear of persecution, tell me your case, why are you being persecuted, but also, why were you unsafe in Mexico? Why were you unsafe in Panama or Costa Rica? Because that sometimes you can unravel, I think, someone who's claiming asylum, you can unravel that by saying, are you coming here for the asylum, or are you coming here for something else? Are you coming here because you have family, or you think there's going to be more jobs or something like that? So trying to distinguish between someone with a legitimate asylum claim and someone who's here because they've got family or they are an economic migrant.
Let's say, for the sake of argument here, David, that that we have a growing number of these cases and they are legitimate. That then puts the burden back on the State Department, I would argue, to say, hey, you better go to those ambassadors and some of those other, the diplomatic staff, the diplomatic corps, and say, what in the world is going on in Guatemala that is causing, an exodus? And I think that Vice President Pence, when he was down there a couple of months ago, was necessarily having some of that conversation, but we don't know. So maybe we ought to be challenging the State Department and putting some burdens back over there. Would you agree?
I think what happens in those other countries is incredibly important for us to understand and to figure out. And for instance, right now, when you've seen this whole issue develop, you've seen a lot of folks on the left, for example, they don't want to talk about enforcing the laws. And if you press them for what we should be doing in the current circumstance, they'll only give you an answer that says, well, we just need to send lots of money to Honduras or something like that. No, well, the reality here is that we should care about the security of Honduras. If Honduras is a more secure place, if it's less dangerous, if we are, if our diplomatic efforts are whatever grant programs, whatever we have going on, are fostering a sense of security, that's a good thing. It will decrease illegal immigration to the United States, but that can't be the only solution. And I think that's what is fundamentally wrong with the left on this issue. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can enforce our laws here, and we should, do so and deal with the crisis we have sort of on our borders. But we can also try to decrease sort of where this illegal immigration is coming from by making those countries more stable and less violent. And so it's a both and I think doing both of those things is one is like we can do one right now. We can enforce our laws right now, and we should do that. But part of the longer term solution is also helping those countries be stable places. And I think right now that's what we're trying to, what we need to figure out is a path forward on that front as well. But that doesn't mean giving up on enforcing our laws in the meantime.
Well said. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with David lnserra, who is a DHS policy expert among one of his expertises over at Heritage Foundation. David, and part of this conversation too, another component that I see missing is Southern Command. Southern Command has a pretty robust footprint in each of these countries. Mm-hmm. And when, if I'm not mistaken, General John Kelly was head of Southern Command, he was sounding the clarion call here that these are the things that are happening. And it kind of just fell on the floor. I mean, he was sounding those alarm bells years ago, almost saying, I'm giving you fair warning that we hear, we see, we're there. These things are happening. And yet Southern Command and his voice never seemed to get the traction that it needed to have, hence where we are today. Did I overstate that, or is that just kind of a dismissed point?
I mean, I do think that, obviously General Kelly has that background, and this goes right to the point I think I was just talking about, which is that, Southern Command, our military resources in the region and the assistance that we provide to these nations and their military and their law enforcement branches, that is an incredibly important relationship that we are trying to build, and we need to continue to build in those countries, because you're right, the problems coming out of those countries, and whether it be illegal immigration, whether it be just continued drug smuggling or other things, the problems are continuing, and in some cases getting worse. And so we cannot afford to just sort of say we can't afford just to stay at our border and just do good border security or good immigration enforcement. We should do those things, but that's not the entire solution. We do need to be thinking about what Southern Command, together with our assistance to, like I said, law enforcement and security organizations in those countries looks like. So how we can actually, like I said, hopefully build more stable societies. You can't have, and some people say you do economic development. Like I say, you throw money at the region. You can't throw money into a region where there's no security and people aren't safe. Or there's massive corruption. You need to make sure that you have good rule of law and order, and stability before you can have these other investments that will result in economic growth and whatnot. So I think that's an important point that General John Kelly focused on, and I think we need to continue focusing on.
I'm going to continue to be a little bit of a snot on this one because we are now putting some of these people on military bases here domestically, and we did some of that under the Obama administration. I mean, we got these tent cities, and we're looking at Fort something or other, and we're doing this and that. Why don't we have those tent cities or some kind of sanctuary post as part of almost a military post that we have in some of those home countries. So we're not bringing them here. We're giving them that same kind of sanctuary there in their home country. So we're taking them out of a hostile address and putting in something that's a little more safer. Is that really an unreasonable suggestion?
Well, I think that would require a significant use of our resources with active boots on the ground in those countries, and I'm not so sure that's something that those countries would all accept. Like having our, like I said, military resources, like physically, being responsible.
Yeah,
for
I don't like
security
it either. But I mean, we're doing it here, so why not
I understand.
there?
Yes, I understand. I also fundamentally, I think that we can't provide security to everyone in that society by just sort of walling off little sort of settlements within the only way to do this is to combat like I said, the trafficking organizations, these international sort of criminal organizations, and the corruption that's endemic in some of these societies. I think you have to sort of take a broader look at the society. Just trying to like I said, do sort of safe zones. Safe zones won't be safe for very long. Once they're infiltrated by the drug trafficking organizations or whatnot. I think we have to. We want that to be the case, that we can sort of protect everyone. But I think the best way to do it is you have to take a broader look at what you can do across society.
There's an awful lot of moving parts to this. David, is it time that we actually revisit our asylum policy or agreements or proclamations that we have with other countries? And, is it too loose? Is something we need to tighten down?
Well, this is certainly one of the things I think we need to be looking at, which is like the whole, for instance, with Mexico. Can we have I think we should be looking at agreements with countries, especially like a country like Mexico, where we say, look, if someone comes to the United States from Mexico and they're from El Salvador, there are agreements we can strike that basically say, look, we're going to make it so that you have a responsibility to hear that asylum claim first, rather than it just being like, oh, you just pass them off to us. And I do think that's something that I think we should be looking to have, because if it's somewhat, while there are unstable and dangerous parts of Mexico, if someone is claiming that they're running away from persecution because of their race, their religion, or whatever, and they get to a different part of Mexico, then while some of that threat may still be there, it's certainly much less than it was in those other countries. And I think we should work with Mexico to try to make it so that they will accept these asylum seekers first. That takes a great deal of burden off of us. And I think in the long run, that is probably just a better policy for us to have. Now, will Mexico go for that? I don't know, but I think it's certainly something that we should be bringing to the conversations that we're having with them.
Especially to the new president, who I think takes office in December. So he could end up, if he does the right thing and we push him to do the right thing, he could end up looking like the hero of the century that he handles some of this. Is this asylum thing, the text or the policy part of Geneva Convention?
Yeah, so it's related in the sense that this is part of the international. It's the same language that we use for a refugee. So it's the same. You have to be persecuted based on your race, your religion, your political beliefs, etc. So it's the same. It's the same language that we use because it's derived. It's the same. Yes, it's the same concept. The only difference is that refugees are normally people who are they're in a third country. So in other words, they fled from Syria and now they're in Turkey. And so in this case, arguably what you've got going on is it would be more like a refugee situation, is actually sort of what we're sort of encouraging. In the sense that we think that's better if we handle these cases before they get to our border.
Indeed, so.
And I think that's just a better way for us to handle things. But yes, the asylum and the refugee systems are similar in that because they have the same sort of fundamental definition at the core about who can apply for refugee or asylum.
David, the elephant in the room is the United Nations. You notice that they're not really weighing in on any of this, are they?
Well, they so far haven't weighed in on too much of it, and I mean primarily because while the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is involved with refugees, asylum issues are issues where the UN doesn't traditionally have any purview, because the Commissioner on Refugees, that organization is responsible, for some degree of helping up setting up tent cities and helping people sort of apply for refugee status. But since these people are showing up at our borders, the UN really does not have as much of a direct role in these situations.
Sure, but they do have, I would say, a role in policy influence and helping to stabilize some of these countries. And I see more instability growing than I do stability happening. So, I mean, I guess I have to give a huge hat tip to Pompeo over at State, where at least he's addressing the religious persecution piece, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're holding some various meetings and sort of summits this week on that very topic. So I know that's something that the administration cares about. And like I said, this speaks to, like I said, part of the refugee and asylum system, the religious persecution that occurs, because that is certainly part of this this whole problem.
And our own legislative body now on vacation. They don't. None of them need to really see where this needs to go. I mean, nobody's really driving a stake in the ground to solve this because of political fear, right?
Yeah. So right, we had the vote on the various immigration bills about a month ago, I guess now. And I remember at the time, I was hopeful that what was going to happen was that the House, rather than trying to pick up these big bills that had various degrees of amnesty in them, I was hoping that they would take the opportunity, to put those bills down, and instead, let's take up bills that directly address the issue of families being separated and the loopholes in our laws and the asylum system. Like, let's solve the problem that's right in front of us and make a tangible improvement to the enforcement of our system.
Not so much.
And instead, it was like, we're gonna continue to just do whatever it is we want. We're going to continue with Plan A, despite the fact that there's actually problems that we could solve if we wanted to. There were multiple members of Congress on the Senate and the House side who presented bills that would do this. Senator Cruz had a similar bill. There's a companion bill in the House. Even Senator McConnell and most of the Senate Republicans got behind a bill which would handle part of these issues. So there was, I think, some desire to do this, but at the end of the day, they just sort of gave up.
Thank you, David and Sarah, Daily Signal and Heritage Foundation, for your time and explanation. We appreciate it. Good work.
Certainly. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
You are about to join Don Newen, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio, and Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience, for a weekly situation report, or SITREP. 18 hours a day, Denise Simon lives her life as an intel analyst. 18 hours a day, Don Newen lives his life in the world of rock and roll. 1 hour each day, Newen receives a daily SITREP from Simon. Welcome to the Drive Time Situation Report. Fasten your seatbelt. You're now in Don Newen's car, and he is calling in for his SITREP.
Check the Talk America Radio schedules for showtimes at talkamericaradio.us.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia, co-host of Cowboy Logic Radio. For 28 years, I was in the mainstream media, most recently as an anchor at the Fox News Channel. No more. Ladies and gentlemen, the mainstream media has completely failed the American people. Radio networks like Talk America Radio will not fail you. Radio shows like Cowboy Logic Radio will not fail you. Check out the entire roster of over 60 weekly radio shows by visiting talkamericaradio.us. That's talkamericaradio.us.
TalkAmericaRadio.us.
Can we do it again? I like it.
Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Gonna really shift some gears here because we've got the real privilege of having Dr. Everett Piper with us, who is from Oklahoma Wesleyan University and the author of Not a Daycare. He's been on with us, I think, 2 or 3 previous times, and we're so grateful for his dedication to many topics and for his time here today on the Denise Simon Experience. So welcome, Dr. Piper.
Hey, Denise, thanks for having me on again. It's always a pleasure.
We got this crazy thing going on, babies. I don't even know how to say it. It just kind of doesn't come out of my mouth right. But let me start off by asking this kind of sidebar question in all of this. Dr. Piper, every generation should be better off than the previous one. And I would also say that is not with opportunity or economically, but also biblically, religiously, and culturally. And I'm just not seeing that trend in a wholesome total. Are you?
Well, there's so much to talk about with regard to this. I mean, we could go a dozen different directions. So you're going to have to control me here and keep me from going down rabbit trails.
No. This is all you, Dr. Piper.
But let's make sure the listeners understand what you said, babies, and I want to make sure they understand what you're saying. It's THEY, babies, rather than babies. And we have a movement right now that's playing off of the gender fluidity argument and off of the transgender, trans identity argument that when your child is born, you should not even tell anyone whether it's a boy or a girl, and you should not dress them differently. You should not address them differently. You should use gender-neutral pronouns rather than he or she, and you should allow your child, therefore, to claim and identify as what they want to. They wouldn't even feel comfortable with saying he or she wants to, what they want to. In other words, rather than being a parent and training up your child in the way he should go so that when he is old he does not depart, and taking the responsibility of parenting your children and modeling for your children and mentoring your children and catechizing your children and telling them what is right and wrong and good and evil and just and unjust, rather than being a parent, you're reversing the entire order and you're letting the child parent you, apparently. It's just social engineering run amok, and you're venturing these experiments that the left, the progressives, are venturing onto our children are deplorable. And Jesus tells us that you'd be better off to tie a millstone around your neck and be cast into the sea than to mislead one of these innocent little ones. And what could be worse? What could be worse than subjecting them to our sexual confusion when a young child has no ability whatsoever to understand that confusion or even care? But we're imposing that upon them in this baby's transgender gender fluidity argument. I'm going to take a breath here, but it's cruel. It's cruel. It is not well grounded in research. It elevates tolerance above love, and let me draw that point home, and then I will let you read. Okay. So here, what I said on the O'Reilly factor 2 or 3 years ago when he invited me on to discuss the religious freedom debate. At the point of closure, I looked at Mr. O'Reilly and I said to him, Mr. O'Reilly, on your anniversary, did you send your wife an I tolerate you card? And there was a pause, and I said, well, I would suggest you didn't, because if you did, it didn't end very well, and there's a reason. The reason is tolerance is an inferior virtue. It says, I don't care, do what you want. Love is a superior virtue. It says, I care a great deal, now stop. Love is superior. Christian charity is always superior to tolerance because it cares, whereas tolerance is careless. When I was raising my boys, I put them to bed every night, and I read a Bible story, and I read a regular story, quote unquote. We prayed, and I always said, I love you. Not once did I ever say, I tolerate you. And there's a reason. It would make no sense. It would insult them. It's not good parenting. It's indifference rather than doing what's right and just and real and helping your kids understand the reality of life rather than these fantasies and fabrications that these people are worshiping.
Dr. Piper, we're hearing that at the age of 4, that is the pivot point that we can now introduce them to what genders are and that they can make their own decision at the age of 4.
Who in their right mind that's been a parent thinks that's true? I mean, when you raised your kids and I raised my kids, did you ever think that your kid had the mental ability, the mental maturity, the cognitive capacity to evaluate something as complex as that particular question when they were 4 years old? I don't know anybody that would assume, I don't know any viable, well-trained secular psychologist that would agree with that. Until recent times, maybe people have been drinking the Kool-Aid, but I have one of my degrees and it's in psychology, and we never would have presupposed that a 4-year-old has the mental or cognitive or moral capacity to make that choice.
This is it's child abuse. I don't care what anybody says. I mean, I could be just way out there, but this is a trend of what I would say is institutional child abuse. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know if we have 1/100th of 1% of the population that is doing this. I don't know if it's 100 people or sets of parents or 100,000. We don't know what that number is. But even if it's 1, it's wrong, right?
I agree. And let's look at the slippery slope here. There's an argument that at the age of 4, that the child has the capacity to consent and to make decisions on his or her sexuality. That's what the argument is that you just presented. You paraphrased it, but that's essentially the premise to their argument. Correct. That somehow this 4-year-old has the capacity to consent and make choices with regard to sexuality. Now, if you take that as the premise for this argument, what do you think is going to happen next? You're going to hear people saying that children have the ability to consent when it comes to matters of sexuality. Now you're going to hear arguments to dumb down the age of consent from 16 to 14 to 13 to 12 to 10 to what? Where does it stop? And if consent is your only measure of sexual morality, which the secular left and the progressives would argue, what was wrong 5 minutes ago because nobody consented is all of a sudden morally right now because somebody coerced them through consent. That's the measure of morality, and that's the way we've been living as a culture for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Consent is the only standard of morality we have left in our culture. Now, if you are now suggesting that children have the capacity of consent, then what's next in terms of the decisions that they're going to be involved in terms of sexual behavior?
Voting.
Yeah.
Register them to vote.
And the hypocrisy of this, the same people that will suggest that a 4-year-old has the capacity to make these sexual choices and decisions have fits over them having, if somebody gives them an aspirin at school without written permission. So the inconsistencies that are endemic in this argument are obvious also. Children are children, and we should treat them as such, and we should protect them in like manner. Adults are adults, and they should accept the responsibility of parenting those children rather than flipping the equation and let the children parent them.
Dr. Piper, where are the churches, and where's the Vatican on this?
I don't know where the Vatican is. I'm obviously Protestant. I'm evangelical. I'm Wesleyan. So I'll comment on the emergent discussion that exists within the evangelical church. And frankly, I'm going to be a sour pill on this. I think the church is AWOL right now. I was on a panel discussion out at the National Religious Broadcasters Association, and Eric Metaxas was the moderator. And on the panel was Dennis Prager, Larry Elder, Jim Daly, and myself. And the question before us was, is Christianity under attack? And all of the panelists said yes. And I was the last one to answer. And I said, my answer is yes, too. Obviously, Christianity is under attack. There's so many examples and anecdotes to prove that. But I'm going to suggest it's not just under attack from the culture, but even more so from the church. The church is attacking Christianity as much as anybody else. I was reading a quote today from G.K. Chesterton, a 100-year-old quote, where he said, it has come upon us that the last Christians, and then he paused and he said, well, no, not the last Christians, but the Christians who now exist that want to blaspheme Christianity rather than support it, are creating a new religion of worshiping sex. Okay, and this was Chesterton 100 years ago.
Wow.
That the church at the time was creating a new religion where it worshipped sex, and don't we find ourselves in that place today? It is a religious fervor, and the church, because we have a low view of Scripture, we've dumbed down the definition of the word to a construct rather than an immutable revelation. We now find ourselves with the inability, like C.S. Lewis told us, you've got to have a measuring rod outside of those things being measured, or you can do no measuring. And if you don't have that measuring rod, the objective standard of God's revealed truth, which the church has been the caretaker of, how can we have a rational debate on these issues? It all digresses to power if there is no eternal principle.
Presently, the Department of State under Secretary Mike Pompeo is doing what I would call a noble effort on a religious freedom mission. And the State Department is putting religion back into, I would say, a worldwide discussion. It's trying to protect those freedoms. It's trying to even talk about those freedoms and even what is maybe inside some of those freedoms. I don't know the whole syllabus of this mission, but it is underway at the Department of State. Is this a good thing? And what would you think would be the success of the mission on the other end, if it's even measurable?
Well, I do think it's a good thing. I think anytime you've got the government recognizing that religious freedom should be promoted and protected rather than attacked, we need to, as a body of Christ, celebrate that. Now, I think as a conservative, I think the less the government is involved in that solution, the better off we are. I think the government's job is to guard the gate. That's it. The government's job is to guard the gate. In other words, stand there and keep other people from intruding into my church, into my life, into my conviction, and suggesting that I have to violate my faith as a matter of practice, whether it be in the privacy of my own church or whether it be in the public arena. I should have the right to practice my faith, and the government should never presuppose otherwise. Mm-hmm. I'm grateful that Pompeo and the Trump administration are doing this. you may not know this, your listeners probably don't, is that I sued the federal government. Oklahoma Wesleyan sued the federal government for a violation of our religious freedom with regard to the abortifacient mandate. And I sued HHS and the Office of Civil Rights and said, no, we stood with the Little Sisters of the Poor, and we said, we will not compromise our pro-life convictions at Oklahoma Wesleyan, and you don't have the right to tell a bunch of nuns that they've got to use contraception. That's kind of crazy in the first place. And second, it's none of your business to tell these nuns or Oklahoma Wesleyan what to do. Now, as I'm suing the federal government, the administration changes from Obama to Trump. So rather than having to fight the HHS and the OCR, I actually get a letter from HHS and OCR inviting me to Washington, D.C. to speak at a ceremony where they announced the creation of a new division protecting religious freedom. Now, I celebrate that. In fact, as I took the podium out there, I said, boy, is it glad to be coming out here to thank you guys rather than sue you guys. That is the difference of what we're dealing with right now, and I'm grateful for it.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Now, this will put religion and gender, I might add, back where it needs to be. And certainly, we talk around the topic and we talk past each other on it, but there doesn't seem to be any cohesive proclamation from, I would say, political parties or churches or any other kind of non-government agencies. There isn't some kind of accommodation for everybody, is there? I mean, it's going to just stay divided, I see, because I mean, people are too afraid of lawsuits and too afraid of some kind of political repercussion. Is that right?
Well, I think people are afraid. I think people, and that's not new in our time, in our day. It's been the case throughout human history. In fact, you go back to Bonhoeffer in the face of the Holocaust and World War II, and what was Bonhoeffer's famous quote? He said, "Not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless." So Bonhoeffer was frustrated with the church, not speaking, not acting, and he said, you guys are guilty of the act itself via your silence, and you need to speak up as the body of Christ and call a spade, and this is evil. And if you don't say so, you're guilty of the evil. So I think that challenge for us in this time, in this day, is to speak up with truth and grace and call the issue what it is. And what we have today is conflicting religions, quite frankly. You have secularism, which is a religion, and you have Christianity. And Chai Feldblum, Obama's administration appointment, has said that she sees no situation where religious freedom and sexual liberty are in conflict, where sexual liberty should not prevail. So she has admitted that the LGBTQ agenda should prevail as a religion over and above Christianity.
Religion. Mm-hmm.
Because when they're in conflict, the LGBTQ sexual libertine agenda should prevail, because she holds that in higher regard. And I think the Christian community, the religious community, needs to speak up and say, we disagree. We've got constitutional protections that cannot be violated. And just because somebody wants to behave in a given way sexually should not trump our religious freedom, and we should not have to celebrate or participate in that particular behavior. So they are in conflict. My answer to your question is they obviously are in conflict. And the way we vote is going to determine which side those freedoms fall, I suppose. Because if we continue to vote for the Obama administration and Chai Feldblum, then we're going to continue to have people that think that their sexual liberty should trump religious conviction when it comes to public decisions. But that's not the history of our free republic. In fact, it's the exact opposite.
Dr. Piper, when it comes to the delivery room, and a doctor has to fill out a birth certificate, and on this birth certificate he has to put the gender and the weight and, you know, all these other kinds of things. What's he supposed to put on there for these parents that want thigh babies or they babies? Yeah, I can't even say it right.
These parents are actually telling the doctor not to put anything on there. And apparently the doctors are complying. But now let's stop and think about the lunacy of that. The left likes to accuse you and me and other conservatives, usually Christians, for being anti-science. Oh, you guys are science deniers. You deny science. Well, what is more scientifically verifiable? What is more of an empirical fact than a scientist called a medical doctor pronouncing upon you at birth that it's a boy or it's a girl? This is a biological, physiological, genetic fact. And now we're being called science deniers because we want science to be acknowledged at the point of birth. Again, social engineering, it's the deconstruction of what it means to be real, and it is imposing these Gnostic ideas upon children. It's a revival of Gnosticism, quite frankly, because Gnosticism, the age-old Christian heresy of 2,000 years ago, was the division of the mind and the body, and the diminishment of the body, and the elevation of the mind, special knowledge, gnosis. And now we find ourselves in the exact same place today where people know how to redefine biology and physiology. They diminish the material, the obvious reality of what it means to be human, because they know they have gnosis that's superior to everybody else. They're smarter than thou. It's a revival of the heresy of Gnosticism.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Dr. Everett Piper, who is the author of Not a Daycare. You can find him on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, from Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Thigh babies. So does the government step in and say there are two genders, period, and make that declaration?
I don't know if they will. I don't know if we're at the point of no return. I think the church needs to make that clear. People with common sense, people that... I do think this is winnable. Let me give you an example of how we can win this debate.
Okay, cool. I need that.
All right, let's try to end on a positive here.
Yay!
Okay, reclaim the high ground of the definition of words. For example, how can you be a feminist if you're going to deny the fact of the feminine? How can you be pro-woman if you deny that women are real and pretend that there's some fabrication or fantasy of a dysphoric male that wants to raise his hand and say, I'm a woman? When that happens, women and children are always the first to lose. Mm-hmm. Women lose when the male libido is unleashed to this lunacy. So claim the high ground of feminism. I'm a feminist because I believe in the female and I believe in the feminine, and I couldn't be a feminist if I denied it like you all are telling me I should. I'm pro-woman because I believe that women are real. They're not leprechauns and unicorns. You don't make them up. They actually have real rights because they have real bodies and real existence. So, progressive left, if you want to argue for women, and if you want to argue for the rights of the female and be a feminist, you can't do it if you start denying those things as fact.
Good. I mean, you make it easy. So why haven't you fixed it?
Well, people, I need 100,000 more of you out there saying the exact same thing. It'll be fixed.
Well, I suppose if you, Dr. Piper, wrote an op-ed and submitted it to the New York Times or the Washington Post, it would probably be rejected. Thoughts?
Well, it might be. As you know, I write weekly for the Washington Times, and yes. I have total liberty to say so. People want to follow this type of commentary and add a couple of arrows to your quiver as you're debating people. I write weekly for the Washington Times, so go find it there. I have been picked up by Fox News and others, and I have been blessed to be on NBC and MSNBC and Dr. Drew and whatnot with regard to other commentary. So common sense does catch some folks' attention periodically. If you stay at it with courage and confidence and clarity, and you ask good rhetorical questions like Jesus did, don't try to win the argument every time. Just ask the logical question that exposes the brokenness of the other person's worldview. You know, whose face is on the coin? Why do you call me Lord? Do you want to pick up the first stone and throw it? That's Jesus. He could have won the debate. He knew the answer. The smartest guy to ever walk the face of the earth. He's God. He knew how to debate, but often he chose just to ask the question and expose the lie of the opponent's worldview. And I think if we ask the same type of questions, do you believe in the feminine? Do you believe in females? Are you pro-woman? Do you believe that women should have their rights? And then be quiet and listen to the answer. Then you win because you can take the high ground of defending the very things that your opponent thinks they stand for. They stand for justice. Well, how can you have justice if there is no judge with a capital J? They stand for goodness. How can you have anything that's good without a God? We can win this debate by asking the right questions and then responding with the power of natural law, common sense, self-evident truths that are endowed by their creator, a biblical worldview.
Well, yes, and thank you for that. You just plant the seed and hope that somebody has some kind of logical, cogent, responsible discussion on it. Because, I mean, there's institutional facts, there's institutional history, there are things that just cannot be changed. I mean, period. You know, the human can't change weather patterns. We can't go and change the climate, and we can't go change gender at the womb. We can do it later on, I suppose. But I would argue that we are creating perhaps a next generation of fear from the previous generation. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, you know, I would even argue that you can't change gender. When Bruce Jenner dies, and somebody 1,000 years hence digs up his skeleton and does the proper analysis on DNA, skeletal structure, and whatnot, they will conclude that that was a male, because it was. You can't change that. You can do plastic surgery all you want, but you still have the reality of who we are as human beings. So, again, let's be pro-science, let's be pro-fact, let's be pro-female, let's be pro-woman, let's be pro-children, let's not be science deniers, let's pursue reality to its logical end. Even Barack Obama last week in a speech was bemoaning the loss of what? Objective truth within the political arena. I about dropped my lunch when I heard him say that. The guy who told us that if you like your doctor, you can keep him. The guy who told us that the reason for Benghazi was because of a video is now bemoaning the loss of objective truth. Well, I'm glad, Mr. President, that you care. Now let's talk about that measuring rod outside of those things being measured. Otherwise, you can do no measuring. And guess what, Mr. President? That measuring rod isn't you. It's not you. It's not me. It's the objective truth that sets us free.
Dr. Everett Piper, thanks so much for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Love this kind of conversation. Thanks for your endless work on this. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. We'll see you again very soon.